In this exercise we're going to make a bubble straw. So basically that's a simple accessory that's made as a mesh in Blender, and then we're going to export that, import it into Studio and set it up to use the particle system. So to do this we're going to use the accessory tool. So as always, start from a clean project. So if we've been fiddling around, File, New, General. So File, New, General. That just resets the scene. Make sure nothing is selected. So select, None, and then we want to view the sidebar. So View, Sidebar. So this accesses the sidebar where the toolkit is, as always, assuming we have it installed. So click the tab, and then we've got the range of tools that we have available, and we want the attachment tool for this. So click the heading to expand the options, and click on Append Attachment File. That loads in the default male avatar. We can change this to male or female depending on what we're doing, but in this case, because it's a straw, we can just use the male. So let's make a little straw. So we want to add mesh cylinder. So add mesh cylinder. We don't really need to do too much to this project for the mesh. Most of the work is going to be done in Studio. But the crucial element is how we set this project up for particles. So we'll drop in our cylinder, and it's dropped in where the cursor is. So before we do anything, let's just adjust the cylinder. So add cylinder, click on the heading. Let's just reduce this down to 8. And radius, let's go 0.25. That's a bit too big, but we'll leave it for now. Cap fill type, we want that as nothing. Generate UVs, leave that enabled because we can use that, and that is going to be our cylinder. So despite the fact it's appeared where the cursor is, because we clicked on the screen somewhere, we can just use the widgets to move it into position. So we're going to move this to the mouth because it's a straw. So we want the move widget. The widget handles appear, and all we're going to do is just move that into position. Rotate tool changes the widget. So we're just going to toggle between these two tools. Position our tube. Position the tube, and what we can do is use the scale. We're going to scale uniformly, so on all 3 axes. So for that, we just want to click anywhere inside the white loop. Click drag, and that'll just rescale it. So that's scaled on all 3 axes, so front, back, left, right, top to bottom. What we want to do, because that's rescaled it globally, we can click drag the green handle to increase the length, so we're on the x-axis. So click drag, that'll make our tube long again. Just do that again. Get the scale right. That's a bit long for a straw. There we go. That's all we need to do. So the accessory needs to be positioned relative to the mesh where it's going to appear. So in this case, it's at the lips. So next step, we need to apply a material and then apply a texture to that material and then UV map the material to the mesh. It all makes sense in a second. So before we do that though, we can see that our mesh is faceted. So that basically means that each surface is considered a flat plane. We want to change this, so we want to go into the Object menu. So make sure our mesh is selected. Object menu, Shade Smooth. So click on that and it'll smooth our mesh to make it look like one contiguous surface. So with that done, let's apply the material. So material properties, no material here, so we can either click the plus button, that will create an instance but not propagated with some properties, or we can click on new and that will create an instance and populate with properties. So let's just click on new. That creates the material and populates it. Expand preview so we can see what we're doing. There's our material instance. We can double click this to change the name in the aperture, or we can click type in the input box. Let's just call this bubble straw space square brackets 0 close square brackets. That's our IMVU compatible material. We can change the color at this point if we want, but that's incidental because we're now going to shift into shading workspace. Shading workspace. In the bottom half, we've got the node editor where the nodes for our basic material are. And then, of course, at the top, we've got a preview of our straw. So to the material, all we need to do is add texture, image texture. Add texture, image texture. Drop that into place. Connect color output to base color input. The mesh will turn black because we don't have an image associated with it yet. So for that, just click on new. That creates a new generated texture. So we'll get the new image dialog. So we can call this click type bubble straw. Change the size. So width, we can probably go with 64, with a height of 256. So this will create a lozenge, and we'll see how this works when we unwrap this, or when we look at the UV map. So enter. Generated type, color grid, then click OK, and there is, let's just focus. So view, frame selected. This focuses the view on the selected object so that it rotates around that object much more easily. So that is our tube, and because it generated the UV map when we started, we don't necessarily need to unwrap this, but this is our basic material. So that's our basic material. So we've got an image that's connected to principal BSDF material output. So these are the two defaults. We've just added a custom image. So next, UV editing. So let's go into UV editing workspace, take a look at the UV map. And as suspected, we don't need to do anything with this because the UV map that's basically put, let's switch to preview mode so we can see the image. The UV map that's generated and view frame selected. The UV map that was initially generated fits our requirements because this is a very simple object, but we might have needed to unwrap and edit the UVs. And there are a number of ways of doing that depending on what it is that we're actually unwrapping, but this is good for our intentions and purposes. So that is UV unwrapped and it is UV mapped. So back to layout. let's save the project at this point. So we have a version save. So File, Save As, browse to where we want to save this. Give it a name. And a version number, just in case. And save as. So that is our basic mesh. What we need to do now is prep this for use in IMVU. So for that, what we want to do first is select the bone that we're going to associate this object with. In this case, that's the head bone that sits inside the avatar's head. So if we just hide that for the moment, and the hair, we can see the head attachment. So that's the bone that represents the bone of the avatar's head. So what we want to do is select that as our attachment point. So we can either select it from the list by clicking this box, or we can use the eyedropper, click, then select the armature that we want to use. But make sure, just press escape, make sure that our mesh is selected before we do this. So make sure the mesh is selected, eyedropper, then click on the head. So that sets up that relationship so that the toolkit knows that we're going to use the head bone. What we need to do next is parent and link the mesh to that bone. And we do that by clicking the Setup Mesh button. And again, make sure our mesh is selected, then just click Setup Mesh. And what happens is that we get another armature appearing that is going to be the actual thing that we use to set up our object. So if we hide, so there is the head armature, and if we click again in the same space, we should select Attachment Rig. That's what we're going to use to finish off this setup. So select the head, and in the outliner we just need to hide this so that we can see the attachment, because what we're going to do here is add a target bone for the particle system. So what we want to do is add a bone to this armature at the end here so that the particle system has a reference point for the particle to emit from. So for that, make sure our armature is selected, enter edit mode, so we're switching from object mode, so it's outlined this orange color, into edit mode, and then what we can do is add another bone to this armature. So we could duplicate, so we could select one of the bones and duplicate it, or from the Add menu, we can click Add Single Bone. That will add a new bone. Unfortunately, it's at the location of the cursor, but as with the mesh when we originally dropped that in, what we can do now is select the bone. So click on the body of the bone to select it. Using the widget tools again, we just need to move this into position. So if we want to reposition the 3D cursor, what we can do is go into View, the 3D cursor, we can change its location. So if we change this to 0, see the cursor has jumped its position, 0, and then 0, so it's here now, and then 0 again. That's down at the feet of the avatar. So whatever you add to the scene will appear at the cursor's location. So if it goes all over the place because you've clicked somewhere, just reset it. In the View tab. And that makes it easier just to move everything into place. So what we want to do with this bone is move it into position so the bottom is in the opening. So again, because we're moving around the scene and we want to move around the object, just go into View, Frame Selected. Numpad period, if you have your numpad, is the shortcut key for that. So we want to drop that into the end of our straw, like so. So that's step one. Now what we need to do is connect that to the rest of the armature. So we want to be in Bone Properties for this. Make sure our bone is selected. Then in Relations, we want to set a parent. So for that, just click on the bone icon and we'll get a list of available bones. And for this, we can link this to attachment root. Click Set, and there it is. Here is our relationship line. What we can also do here, make sure our bone is selected, is just rename it. So click Type, just call this Bubble Straw. So to check this relationship, this is important. In the outliner, we want to find the attachment export folder where our content is. That's going to be exported. We want to look at attachment rig. What we should find if we expand this is attachment rig, attachment root, attachment node, and there is Bubble Straw. That's the bone that we've created, and that is the child of attachment root. This relationship is important, so it's important to double check in the outliner. So attachment, double check the rig, expand the options and make sure the bone that we've created is listed. And that's all we need to do. Exit edit mode, back into object mode. What we should find, just to test this, we need to make sure that everything works the way that we expect it to. So with our armature selected, object mode, pose mode, what we can do is select, so we're clicking and we're selecting. Let's just expand those bones so we can see what we're doing. So we're selecting attachment node when we click once, and then attachment root when we click again. So it's cycling through the selection. But once we've got that, if we just press the R key, we should find that everything moves in relation to attachment root. If we click the other bone, press R again, you might find the straw moves with attachment node. We can link it to either or, it doesn't matter, so long as when attachment root is selected, the entire rig, the entire setup moves with it. So that's all we're looking for. So let's switch out of pose mode back into object mode. And we're about ready to export. So let's just save this file, save as number 2, save as. Let's unhide head. That's the head armature, and then the head mesh, just so that we can see. So that is our accessory setup, and this is essentially all we need to do. So the important part of these types of accessories that make use of the particle system, the important part is the setup of the bone target that's going to be used by the particle system. So what we're going to do when we get this into Studio is tag the particle to this bone. So we need an additional bone if we're not using the actual armature bones. We use this if we're not using root or attachment node. So let's just save that again. Save. Let's go back into the toolkit. Everything is set up. To export, let's just double check. There is our cylinder. And what we can actually do here, double click cylinder, rename this bolt straw. If we wanted to be really efficient, object properties, what we could do, object data properties, we could do this either in the outliner or object properties, doesn't matter which, dot mesh. This doesn't do anything except make it easier to identify our mesh object. So let's just save again. And then one last step before we actually export, we're going to go back into UV editing. There is our image that we created previously. So what we want to do here is save it as an actual bitmap. So image, save as, browse to, and then save our image. We could choose our format. So there's our title, there's our location. We can use any format that IMVU understands if we want to use this image directly, so PNG or JPEG, or we can use a lossless format, Targa Raw, either or, PNG. Disable compression if we want maximum image quality, and then just save. And what this does is it converts the image, the generated image data that Blender creates, converts it into an actual image that is then associated with the material, which means that we can then export this and import it into Studio without any issue. So go back into layout, save our project, and then to export we just click on the export button. So double check that we've got head set as the bone, that's okay, and we're checking the structure and the outliner, make sure everything is inside attachment export. So everything that we want to include with the project when we export it from Blender needs to be inside attachment export. So if we had a number of meshes and some of these we did not want to be included, we would just select them, object, collection, and then move to collection. And this would give us an option of where to move. As we're okay, we can just go ahead and export. So click on the export button. That will do its thing and confirm with a message in the status bar. So we can now import this into Studio and get it set up to use a particle. So in Studio we need to create our new project. So create, or the plus button. And then browse to our derivable. It's an accessory. We want to use the empty accessory. This can be the empty female accessory or the empty male accessory. So we're browsing through our categories, women accessories or men accessories. Either or will do. Select. Gives us a preview. Then we click Derive. So this will show the base avatar or an avatar based on our appearance and settings. And once we have this, we can just import our FBX file. So import FBX, browse to the location of our file, and it will be appended attachment corresponding to the attachment tool that we used. In this case, that is bubble straw. So select, open. This is a preview. Then set up FBX. Everything here is okay, so we don't change the size, that's alright. Skeleton, that's okay. So mesh ID, so click on the menu, select 0. Override meshes, that's okay. Next. Got our material. Next. No animation. Review. That's what's going to be brought in. And import. And this should automatically assemble our straw. So component, just need to make a couple of changes before we add the particle system. So in our materials, there's our material, so material images, that's our textures, and then the material settings. We want to just enable double-sided or two-sided preview. So it's now two-sided. So before we go any further, before we add the particle system, we want to save this. File, save as. Bubble straw 1, save. So now that we've done that, we can add a particle. So we want to go into particles, click on add. This adds a new particle system. There is our instance. We can have multiple particles, and the properties on the right. So here we can rename this if we want. So name, just type, as with the materials, we can type a name, and then we want to set the node from which the particles will emit. So if we enable skeleton, we can see the avatar skeleton and our accessory skeleton, and this is the bone that we're going to be using. So click on the drop down, and there is our bone. So we set that as our origin point. What we can do is preview this right now with these base settings. So these are all the defaults. We can preview this and it will activate and enable the particle system. So let's just save this. Bubble straw 2, and then set up the particle system. So it's 2 steps basically. We set up the mesh first, make sure the materials and any effects that we want to have are in place, save the file, and then we add the particle system. So now that we've done that, we can change some of the settings. First thing we want to do is focus the origin, or focus the emitting of the particles around our pipe. So we go down to origin, we change the start and end radius. Both of these should be 0. So if we preview this, what we now find are the particles emitting from that bone on a windy day. We can change its direction. So at the moment it's emitting sideways. We want it to emit essentially up. So we change the Y normal and the Z normal. 1, 0. Let's try that. Preview. So that's going straight out and eventually down because of gravity. So we want to change the gravity. Make that +1. Preview. So now the bubbles are going up. So we've done 3 things. We've changed the origin to 0 for both the start and end, and that focuses the emission point where the particles come from at our bone. So zeroing both of them forces it to use this point. We then change the direction so that they emit forward of the avatar, and then we change the gravity so that they emit upwards. So once we've got that set up, we can go back to the properties of the particle itself and change the behavior of the particle system. So let's slow them down, so change the rate, let's half that. And then we can also change the max count. So let's change that to 25. Preview. And that slows it right down. What we want to do next, change the speed. So the particles are emitting like this because the speed at which they come out of the emitter is relatively high to what we want. So if we change this minimum, so let's go with 0.1 and let's try 0.3. And there we have instead our bubbles taking a more vertical approach to their exiting from the bubble straw, which is what we want. We can change the count again. This changes the characteristic of the stream itself. And we can change lifetime, how long the particles remain alive. So currently they remain alive to such an extent that they extend all the way up here. We might not want that. So minimum 1, maximum 3. And reduce this down even further, 0.5, 2. That is a much more bubbly particle system. So what we've done, let's go over this again. So we changed the origin, zeroed that out so it uses the end bone of the accessory, changed the direction so that they were projecting forwards. We then changed the gravity so they were projecting upwards. Once we've got that established, we then changed the emission settings so that we reduced the lifetime so that they took a more vertical approach to their emission. We lowered the rate so that reduces the number, and then 50, we reduce that as well, so that similarly affects the number of particles that are emitted at a maximum. We also change the speed, that again helps them emit more vertically. So that is our basic bubble pipe particle. So let's just save this. File, save as. And the next step would be to assign our bubble texture. So for that, we go back into Materials, and we have a material instance that's linked to the particle system that we've added. And this behaves exactly the same way as normal materials. So we can make a simple transparent bubble, new, and your app of choice. Let's just make this 64 by 64. Create. New layer. Flood, fill, black. And then what we want is a shape tool, so that we just draw out a simple sphere. Make this white. If we want it to be opaque, or grey if we want it to be transparent. So make these all the same value. And that will be our bubble. We can use this for both the bubble texture itself and the opacity matters. Save this, save as. Bubble, straw, bubble. Export 64 by 64 JPEG. That's okay. Export. And do that again for our opacity. So back in Studio, select the particle material, and then in the particle properties or the texture properties, we want to change the diffuse. There it is, bubble, select, preview. So there is our texture, and then on the opacity, the same thing again. So the default alpha test is too harsh for the transparency, the opacity, so we need to change the blend. There are our bubbles, and that is our bubble pipe. Obviously we can change the settings and the effects depending on how we want the bubbles to appear. But that is basically setting up our accessory to use a particle system from a specific bone. So all we need to do next is save. Change the product info, so icons, name, profit, and then submit to the catalog. But there is our bubble straw.